Imagine the small white crystals sitting in a jar in your kitchen right now were once the sole power that built, destroyed, or sustained empires. Today, we use salt only to make our food taste better. However, in the ancient world, salt was as valuable as oil is in the modern world. Rome's magnificent columns, the sharp swords of its legionaries, and its endless roads actually rose upon a single mineral, sodium chloride. This is not just a story of two elements combining. It is the first great victory of humanity's survival strategy, economy, and statehood. The Romans did not just add salt to their food, they turned it into a weapon, a salary, and the mortar of a civilization. Think about it. For what substance have wars been fought in the dusty pages of history, and what substance could be considered worth a person's lifetime of labor? The answer lies in that simple yet majestic crystal in the palm of your hand. Why salt? The answer is hidden in our physiology. The human body requires salt for nerve transmission and muscle functions. However, for societies that transitioned to a settled life and engaged in agriculture, the meaning of salt evolved into a much more vital point: preservation. In a world without refrigerators, the only way to store food without spoiling was to coat it in salt. Salt could be considered a way of stopping time. Societies that could store food survived the winters, sent their armies on distant campaigns, and increased their populations. This strategic advantage explains why Rome was founded on the banks of the Tiber River. Rome rose not just on 7 hills, but at the heart of a massive logistical network. Set aside the legends of war regarding Rome's founding, the true heart of the city is the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. Rome was established at the most critical transit point between the coastal salt pans and the inland regions. The Sabines and other Italian tribes had to use this road to feed their animals and preserve their food. By controlling this route, Rome began collecting its first taxes. The city's initial wealth came not from gold mines, but from white crystals filtered from the sea. This road was not only the first route for trade, but also for the Roman army. Every stone stepped upon by a legionary was paved with the financing of salt. Let's look at salarium, the origin of the word salary. Roman soldiers were paid a portion of their wages directly in salt or in cash to purchase it. The phrase "worth his salt" symbolized a soldier's discipline. Salt was a medium of exchange. The Roman state turned salt into a government monopoly to control prices. During times of war, they lowered the price of salt to gain the public's support. During crises, they filled the treasury with salt. The salt in a legionary's stomach and the salt in his pocket were the hidden forces determining the empire's borders.
As Rome grew, salt ceased to be a mere trade commodity and became a geopolitical weapon. Having consolidated its dominance over the other tribes and city-states of the Italian peninsula, Rome set its sights further afield toward the blue waters of the Mediterranean. However, a massive obstacle stood in Rome's way: Carthage. The Carthaginians were the masters of maritime trade and, consequently, the salt routes. The famous Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage are usually described only as a struggle for land and sea dominance, yet the hidden hero behind these wars was once again salt. Carthage's vast salt deposits in North Africa and the silver mines in Spain were the greatest treasures whetting Rome's appetite. Rome knew very well that it could not become a true empire without seizing these resources. War was not won by the sword alone, it was also won by logistics. The Carthaginian armies, especially Hannibal's epic crossing of the Alps with his elephants, required a massive food supply. Preserving this supply depended on using tons of salt to keep the food from spoiling. By targeting its enemy's salt supply chain, it was actually targeting their stomachs and logistical lines. At the end of the Third Punic War, Rome did not just defeat its rival militarily, it swore to erase it from history. According to legend, after the city of Carthage was razed to the ground, the Romans poured tons of salt onto the city's soil. This symbolic act meant that nothing would ever grow on those lands again, and that the city was cursed forever. Here, salt had transformed from a life-giving mineral into a tool of punishment that killed the earth. With the fall of Carthage, Rome was now the sole master of salt in the Mediterranean. It now held control not just over the roads in Italy, but all salt production centers stretching from Spain to Egypt. This monopoly made the Roman treasury the richest vault in history. The salt tax provided the financing for the empire's massive army and public buildings. The people could buy salt at a low price, which increased their loyalty to the emperor. However, when control over salt slipped away, Rome's unshakable authority would also begin to crack. In every new land it conquered, the Roman army's first task was to secure local salt resources. For they knew that whoever controlled the salt controlled both the people's stomachs and the future of the state. Now, let's look more closely at the revolution this economic power created in Rome's social structure.
For Rome, the master of the Mediterranean, salt was no longer just a resource, it was one of the most effective ways to keep the people under control. By taking the production and distribution of salt entirely under its own monopoly, the Roman state became history's first major economic control mechanism. In this system, called annone, the state determined the salt prices itself and balanced social peace in this way. If unrest broke out in the city, or if the emperor needed the support of the people, salt prices were suddenly lowered. In other words, a salt inflation was created. This was the economic bribery of the ancient world. This system, built on the most basic need on the people's table, carried Roman authority to the deepest corners of the kitchen. For Roman subjects, salt was both the key to survival and a silent bond of loyalty to the state. However, this system also had a dark side. Rome used salt as a tool of punishment as much as a reward. In rebelling provinces, salt prices would skyrocket and production centers would be sealed off by military siege. This would cause local economies to collapse and the people to be disciplined with hunger. The Roman aristocracy, on the other hand, had turned this power of salt into a status symbol. In the flamboyant banquets held in wealthy homes, silver salt shakers called salinum were placed in the most honored corner of the table. A guest's proximity to the salt shaker determined their intimacy with the host and their place in the social hierarchy. The position of salt at the table was the crystallized equivalent of Rome's rigid class structure. This immense economic value of salt was also the main source of finance for Rome's engineering marvel, roads. Not only the Via Salaria, but the construction of paved roads stretching to all four corners of the empire was made possible by the taxes obtained from salt. Thanks to these roads, Roman legions could take action quickly to suppress rebellions, and merchants could easily deliver their white crystals even to the most remote places. In other words, salt was both the road itself and the fuel for the army walking on that road.
Rome had drawn its borders with salt and protected those borders with the wealth provided by salt. However, as the empire expanded and the bureaucracy became cumbersome, this perfectly functioning system of salt would also begin to crack. Now, let's look at the final and tragic role salt played on the path to the collapse of Rome.
Like the end of every great empire, Rome's end came not with the destruction of its magnificent buildings, but with the collapse of the systems that sustained those buildings and a massive army. When the imperial borders reached uncontrollable proportions, ensuring the security of the salt roads became an impossible task. When the barbarian invasions from the north began to target the Via Salaria, the empire's lifeblood, and the salt production centers along the coastline, Rome's heartbeat began to weaken. As the salt flow was cut off, all the gears of the state came to a standstill. Inflation peaked, and the sacred salarium payments to the legionaries could no longer be made. The loyalty of hungry and unpaid soldiers dissolved and vanished, just like a salt crystal falling into water. When the city of Rome was plundered by the Visigoths in 410 AD, the white crystal that held the empire together had already crumbled to dust. However, the fall of Rome did not mean the end of salt's reign in history. In the world of the dark Middle Ages, salt lost none of its value. On the contrary, it became even more precious. The feudal lords, the new owners of Europe, fought to seize the salt deposits left behind by Rome. City-states like Venice and Genoa built their power once again on the trade of this white crystal. Salt continued to be known as white gold in the Middle Ages, and castles were built for its sake. The system established by Rome became a source of inspiration for the kingdoms of Europe. The fact that heavy salt taxes were one of the public's greatest angers on the road to the French Revolution proves that this mineral retained its power to determine political destinies even centuries later. Today, as we sprinkle a pinch of salt onto our food in our kitchens, we are actually holding the final link of 1,000-years-old war and geopolitical genius at our fingertips. Perhaps we no longer fight wars for salt deposits, yet from the word salary in our language to the rules of social etiquette on our tables, Rome's ancient signature written in salt is still there. This smallest yet most impactful crystal of history continues to be the flavor and the financial engine of civilization. If this hidden power of Rome and other white treasures that changed the course of history caught your interest, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of discovery. What should be our next stop for an ancient mystery? Share your ideas with us in the comments. In the next episode, we will continue to illuminate the dark corners of history together. Stay curious.